Welcome back from the break. As mentioned, my name is Glynn, and about a year and a half ago, I quit my job and co-founded a digital private payments company. So, as you can imagine, I spend a lot of my time thinking about privacy and digital payment systems. Now, in particular, I'm very interested in how digital services and digital payments are changing the way people and societies think about privacy and security in the way that they interact with everyday life in the world. This talk, as the title suggests, is a summary about how cash evolved in the world, how we built some societal norms around the inherent privacy of cash, how digital services are changing those norms and removing some of that privacy, and how new technology and perhaps new regulation might change things and give us some of that privacy back. Now, to sort of preview the talk, I'm going to start with a story. Then we're going to go back 10,000 years to the beginning of cash. We're going to do a history of cash all the way up to the present. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the future. And then if we have any time left and there are questions, I'll have some questions. So let's dive right in. So everything I mentioned might seem really abstract and hard to understand. And also, if you read the press about tech companies and privacy, you might get the impression that all of this new data that's being collected, all of these new cashless applications are harmful to personal privacy. And I want to start by just saying that that's not necessarily true. And I've got the great story, it's true, it's relatively recent from the United States, that really highlights both the good and the bad privacy aspects of cashless services and sort of the way we interact with them. So let me tell you the story about a man named Jorge Molina. You can see that it's a headline from the New York Times very recently. Mr. Molina was at work one day. He had no idea this was going to happen. The police showed up to his place of work, asked him his name. He said, "Yes, I'm Jorge Molina." They said, "You are under arrest." They accused him of murder, took him off to jail, and he had no idea what was going on. Now, for this particular murder, the police had no witnesses, but there was a security camera that showed the killer showing up and leaving in a white Honda sedan. It just turned out Mr. Molina owned a white Honda sedan. Now, the police had one more piece of information. The police had sent a request to Google asking for information about any Android phones that were at the location of the murder at the time that it took place. Now, there was some back and forth, some negotiating with Google. Google ended up giving the police a little bit of data, and that data showed that Mr. Molina, or at least his phone, was in roughly the same area as the murder when the murder took place. So at this point, the police thought they had an open and shut case. They had the vehicle arriving and leaving. They had the vehicle tied to Mr. Molina. They had Mr. Molina's phone in the location. They thought they were done. But then, Mr. Molina spent roughly a week in jail talking to his attorneys, and this is an example. This is a letter that was sent from his attorneys to the prosecuting attorneys, and his attorneys were able to show that, yes, Mr. Molina owns a white Honda. Yes, he was in roughly the same neighborhood when the murder took place, but no, he was not driving his white Honda at the time. Now, one of the key pieces of information that exonerated Mr. Molina for this crime, which I have highlighted, is a receipt from an Uber ride. And they were able to use that receipt and some other information to show that Mr. Molina was with some friends, and he had traveled through the rough area where the murder took place, but he was in an Uber with two friends. He had the receipt to prove that he was the person who had paid for the Uber, connected with the driver. His friends corroborated the story, and he was let out of jail. Now, complicating the story a little bit, the police ultimately discovered that someone that Mr. Molina knew actually took his car and used it to commit the murder, and then put the car back. And they weren't necessarily trying to frame Mr. Molina, but they were trying to hide their own activity. And so let's just stop and think about this a little bit. It's very likely that if Mr. Molina didn't have a smartphone and didn't have apps installed that were tracking his location, he probably wouldn't have been implicated in the crime. But had he been implicated in the crime, he needed that Uber data to be able to prove that it wasn't him. And so to me, the story of Mr. Molina really captures everything you know about the way that we in society interact with modern technology. You can, at the same time, you can have one app on your phone that implicates you in a crime, and at the same time, you can have a cashless transaction record that you performed using your phone that exonerates you from that same crime. And specifically to the case of Mr. Molina, 10 years ago, before the widespread adoption of Uber, if the police had been able to place Mr. Molina's car at the scene of the crime, he very well could have gone to jail for murder, because that would have been a very strong piece of evidence against Mr. Molina, and he would not have been able to easily rebut it. When I read this story, I just sat back and thought, like, is this good? Is this bad? I have no idea. But something that's important, I think, for everyone to understand is, good or bad, this is the present, and this is the world that we all live in. So that's the conclusion of the story, and let's move on and talk about cash. So privacy was not necessarily a design goal of cash when people started creating cash and started using it. It was just a property that happened to be a byproduct of the technology that was available at the time. So, as I mentioned, this is called a tally stick. We know that these were used in 10,000 BCE. There's some evidence of their use perhaps going back another 5,000 years. What a tally stick is you have two copies of it, and it's a record of transactions or a record of credits and debts. And the creditor has one copy, the debtor has another copy. Anytime a payment gets made, the two parties would come together, make marks on the tally sticks, verify that they match, and then everybody had their own copy of it. This particular tally stick comes from medieval England, and it represents the annual taxes that are due from a farmer or from a shepherd to a church. The actual value of it, because there was some other data around this when they collected it, it's 20 pennies per head of sheep, and this was a relatively prominent shepherd, and so he owed his local church roughly 3 pounds per year. So this was really the first thing that we had, not quite cash, but cash-like. So now let's jump forward 8,000 years, and this is one of the example of representative money, where you actually have a physical object that represents a unit of value. These are cowrie shells. This particular example of cowrie shells were found in China. They date to roughly 1600 BCE. And again, cowrie shells were private in the sense that you had a pile of them. No one necessarily knew about them. You could give them to another person. No one other than the recipient of them knew, why they were handed over, what the value was, etc. And again, not private by design, but it was just a privacy as a byproduct of what was then, leading edge cowrie shell payment technology. So if we move a little more forward, we go forward another 1,000 years. This is an example of the first example of what we would consider to be money or coins, in the sense that we still use coins today. These are from the 6th century BCE. It's from the kingdom of Lydia. You can tell by the lion's head embossed on it. At the time, this was an area that was known as Asia Minor. Present day, it's the former Lydian kingdom is in western Turkey. So, and these coins, they're also electrum, which is an alloy of gold and silver. You can't use gold for coins, 100% gold for coins in commerce, because they're too soft. So this is really the very first money that we would recognize today as money. But I'm sure everyone here probably uses money. You probably have some money with you. You probably don't have a pile of coins. What you have is probably something like this. So we jump forward another 1,500 years to, again, going back to China. This is going to be a theme that I'm going to be coming up with, that a lot of the technological innovations in money did come out of China. So these are Song Dynasty banknotes. This is from roughly 1100 AD. And again, so this is not a receipt. This is not a record of a transaction. This is actual paper money. And this is one of the first examples of paper money that could be used for a wide variety of general purchases, and that was used in a wide geographic area. Prior to this, we had what we might more think of as private money, which was used by individuals, maybe could only be used to purchase one kind of good, but this is really the first example of banknotes in the sense that we think of them today. Now, From here until 1950, in terms of money, not a lot happened. By 1100 AD, you've got coins, you've got banknotes, and not a lot changed. A lot of things changed in finance and in commercial banking. We got double entry bookkeeping, we got the stock corporation, but in terms of the nuts and bolts in cash, basically nothing happened. And then we got computers. Another common theme that you'll see when you look at sort of the development of payments and cash is that as soon as a new technology comes around, it gets used in finance almost instantly. Now, there were two really big trends that we get into the modern era that really drove cashless commerce, and one of them was the creation of easy non-cash payment options. We really needed computers and data collection in order for that to take place. So this is a computer called IRMA that Bank of America started using in 1950. And it's notable that this is only 4 years after the very first computer was created. So the first sort of modern general purpose digital computer was ENIAC, which came out in 1946, and this is 1950. So, research project, 4 years later, operationalized. The primary use of IRMA was for processing checks, because at the time, banks were drowning in the check clearing process. It was a manual process. It took entirely too long. And Bank of America was the first to adapt a modern sort of digital technology in processing checks. And one of the byproducts that Bank of America got was that in addition to be able to process checks, they also had a bit of computer memory. So now they were actually able to store a record of who paid whom, how much, and sort of create records over time, which is kind of the beginning of credit profiles. So let's move. There we go. And then 8 years later, after the first computer, probably everyone has at least one of these and probably has a bit of a love-hate relationship with them. This is Bank America Card, which was the first, again, general purpose, widely available, widely used credit card. The launch of this credit card was very interesting. It's known in payment circles as the drop. What Bank of America did was a fairly clever, not a technology hack, but more of a interpersonal hack. So the problem that Bank of America had is that they would go to people and say, hey, we have this credit card, you should use it. And people would say, well, none of the merchants that I interact with use this. And Bank of America would go to merchants and say, hey, here's this credit card processing machine, you should use this. And the merchants would say, well, none of my customers use this. So what Bank of America did is they picked one city, which was Fresno, California, and they just sent, I think, every household in Fresno a credit card. No application process, it just showed up, everyone got it on the same day. And then Bank of America was able to go to merchants and say, hey, everyone who lives in this town has a credit card. And that got merchants to sign up for the service, accept the concept of a processing machine. And so this kind of idea of saturating a user base and creating the demand to get the merchants to install, that's something that you'll see over and over again in sort of modern technology payments. So the real interesting thing about the Bank America card is that it was probably the first relatively frictionless, remote way to make a cashless payment. And that's one of the things that's really key for a cashless society, is that you need, before we had these, you had to be physically present in a store to hand over your money in order to pay for something. But now you don't have to do that. Now you could buy something over the phone. Now, I said that was one part of it, the ability to have a remote payment. The ability to remotely receive goods is the other half of it, and that's what really brings it together. So this is probably a little bit familiar to everybody. This is the beginnings of putting together the second piece, the remote delivery of goods. This is, I found this online. This is the original Amazon.com homepage from late 1995 and early 1996. Yeah, Amazon famously just started selling books, and they've later expanded to basically everything. I probably use Amazon to purchase 80% of all of the sort of household goods that I buy, which means I have way too many cardboard boxes in my garage and frequent trips to the recycler. So the effect of Amazon plus credit cards is that you had a lot of everyday transactions, the buying groceries, the going to the hardware store, going to the department store. Those moved away from being in-person transactions and shifted over to being remote transactions online using the internet for the purchase, a delivery service for delivery, and credit cards for payment. And so at this point, you start to see commercial transactions really being shifted to cashless. But there was one area where cash was still really king, even in the late 90s, and that was in the settlement of interpersonal debts. You know, if I owed you $100 or $50, I wouldn't expect you to have a credit card machine. I would just give you cash. And so we see PayPal popped up. This is PayPal's homepage from 1998 when they launched. And PayPal was able to use existing credit card technology, and also this is around the same time that we saw e-banking really take off. And so PayPal was able to take those technologies that were designed for sort of formal commerce with merchants and use that for the settlement of interpersonal debts and peer-to-peer payments. This is really kind of when you initially saw people using the phrase peer-to-peer payments. So that kind of brings us up to 2000, and then we have one last technology trend that really brings us to the present in terms of cashless payments, and that's everything moving from the desktop computer, which is really a fixed location inside your home, to everything going onto your smartphone, which adds a lot of convenience, and it also adds quite a bit of privacy complications because, prior to all of our payment systems being on our phones, when they were in our houses, sure, your merchants and your counterparties, they knew what your address was, but they knew that anyway because they had to send you things. So as soon as we went to payments being on your phone, we started adding in location data. And we started adding in a lot of transactions that previously thought people couldn't have been used. You couldn't have had an electronic way of doing it. Suddenly, we started seeing those being shifted over to electronic payments. So people are probably familiar with these. These are the big two payment systems in China, Alipay and WeChat Pay. And it's really, for a Western audience, it's really hard to explain the impact that these payment services had on the way that merchants and people operate and perform financial transactions in China, because China never really adopted the credit card. And it allowed rapid adoption of these phone-based mobile cashless payment systems because there wasn't a big embedded infrastructure of credit cards. A lot of other countries, people were comfortable using credit cards, they were set in their ways. Merchants had invested huge amounts of money in processing merchant payments. We had this whole credit card ecosystem that really didn't exist in China. And so China was able to very, very rapidly leapfrog over that and go directly to app-based, sort of QR code-based payments. And something we're seeing with these payment systems right now is that they work very well inside China, and they're starting to expand outside of China. So the first use case for sort of cross-border payments using these apps is for tourism. And the use case is that if you are in China and you're using one of these systems, when you travel, you don't have to carry cash with you, you don't have to carry traveler's checks with you, you don't have to worry about exchange rates, you don't have to worry about figuring out what money is what when you're traveling countries. You can just go, you have your phone, you use Alipay, everything works. And so in my hometown of San Francisco, it's fairly common to see big pay with Alipay signs in shops and stores that sort of cater to tourism. And that's it's quite unique because merchants in these areas in the United States are devoting a fairly large amount of their advertising real estate to a payment service that's not available to people living in America. But there's such a volume, especially in San Francisco, of Chinese tourism, and it's such a convenience factor. It's really something that drives the tourist dollar into these stores, and that's why they do it. Now, this is enormously convenient, but it's also not very private. And the result of these systems is that you've got these two companies Ant Financial, their corporate parent is Alibaba, and Tencent, which is the corporate parent of WeChat, they're now able to collect these huge volumes of payment data, including sort of out-of-the-country payment data that they never would have had before. And so the last area where cashless payments are really causing a big disruption, and also something that brings us back around to that story of Mr. Molina that I opened with, are the Uber and Lyft, and all of the other app-based cashless ride-sharing apps. Uber and Lyft are particularly interesting in terms of the data collection story, because in most cities around the world, cabs are regulated, and there's usually limits on how big a cab company can get. So, a lot of times a cab driver would be a sole proprietor. It would just be, their cab, or you might have a small company that owned tens or maybe 100 or 200 cabs. And so the fact that it was so distributed, that really prevented the aggregation of a lot of data around people and where they move around. And also, cabs were primarily a cash-based system. So, if you visited a city, you'd get in a cab. The cab was a sole proprietor. You'd pay him in cash. The cab driver doesn't remember who you are. There's really no data collected about that. Now with Uber and Lyft, if you habitually use Uber wherever you travel around the world, Uber's got all your transaction history, and they also have all your location history, which is it's a big change in the way that people are sort of interacting with the world and the way that they're paying things. And as I mentioned with the story of Mr. Molina, this data, it's not good and it's not bad, but it definitely exists, and it's having these strange unintended consequences where it might implicate you in a crime. It might exonerate you in a crime. It might be used to advertise services to you. Maybe those services are useful. Maybe it's used to show you a new product you didn't know about. Maybe it shows you a product that you find very annoying. And so I'm trying to sort of remove some of the morality from it and just saying that this data exists. It's being used for lots of purposes, and we should probably have broader conversations about what data should be collected and how it should get used. So that brings us up to the present. So where are we today? I've got a slide that I'm going to show in a second that sort of summarizes all of these modern cashless payment systems, and they're divided along two axes. One is speed, which is labeled as performance. That's how quickly does a payment clear, and also for that entire system, what global volume of simultaneous payments can they handle? What's their throughput? And then the other axis is privacy, which sort of divides the cashless payment world up into four nice quadrants. And so here we have. It might be a little bit hard to read if you're in the back, but I'm going to start in the bottom right and sort of move around clockwise. So in the bottom right, you have a collection of traditional payment systems. These are typically very fast, and they're typically not private at all. These are your Visa, your MasterCards, your Amexes, your PayPals, things like that, the very traditional cashless payment systems. In the bottom left, where you have systems that are sort of neither private nor performant, you have what I refer to as the first generation cryptocurrency systems. I'm not going to talk too much about cryptocurrency. We've got a fantastic speaker coming up in about half an hour who's going to give you a whole deep dive on that topic. But Bitcoin, Lightning, Ethereum, you can think of them almost as research systems. People thought that they were private when they first launched, but it turns out that when you have a ledger that's fairly comprehensive of transactions, it's actually not very private at all. And with sufficient analytics, you can do a lot to uncover who's paying whom. So moving around the squares, if you go to the upper left, these are some of the second and third generation cryptocurrency products. These are cryptocurrency products sort of building on top of the lessons learned from Ethereum and from Bitcoin, and they're designed specifically with privacy engineered in. The problem with most of these is that they're relatively slow. And then we have that top right corner, which you'll see is empty. And I think, at least for me, this is where I want my payment systems to be. I want them to have the speed and convenience of Visa or Alipay, and I want them to have the privacy of something like a Zcash. And we don't really have anything in there yet. So how do we fill in that square? I think that there's two ways we can do it. One is a pure technology play. The other one is a regulatory play. And I think reality is that we're going to end up with some mixture of both of them, in the ideal world. So I just want to preface this by saying that if any of you work in the EU or have customers in the EU, you probably spent a big chunk of 2017 and 2018 working on GDPR compliance. I did too. You've got my sympathies, and I share your pain. But GDPR could be a model for the way that we could enforce privacy in our cashless payments by regulation. Now, I don't think that GDPR directly solved this problem. My view of GDPR is that it was much more of a notice and compliance system. It didn't really dictate terms. It dictated a process of disclosing information sharing to users. But we could have something that was GDPR-like and specific just to payments that really provided firm restrictions on how long payment processors can hold onto their data, who they can give it to, and when it should be deleted. And you could even build in safeguards for things like crime and terrorism by perhaps putting some of this data in a secure storage area where it could only be accessed subject to a warrant or some other legal, valid legal process. That's one way to do it. Now, the other way to do it, as I mentioned, is that there are some of these second and third generation cryptocurrencies that, instead of relying on regulation for privacy, they've actually got the privacy engineered into the protocol. Everyone involved in this area has to give credit to the Zcash project and Zuko Wilcox, who was really the first person to build a live functioning system that had privacy, cashless payments with privacy baked into the protocol. It was extremely forward-thinking of him. This was an idea that had been kicking around in the research community for 15, almost 20 years in computer science academic research, but Zuko actually went out and built the first one. And now this is another view of the way forward. We could retain the convenience of digital payments and the privacy of cash using these privacy-forward cryptocurrencies, and that could really give us the best of both worlds. Right now, the major challenges in these systems is making them faster, making them easier to use, and making them work on mobile payments from mobile phones, because mobile payments is really the wave of the future. So that is basically the history and present and potential future of cashless payments and how they interact in society. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.